The Bible prophesies in Ezekiel 38 and 39, a great war is coming to Israel, led by Russia and the Islamic nations against Israel. But there is a piece missing in that puzzle, a hole in the prophecy that nobody can yet figure out what it means. I brought an expert on who's going to reveal what that missing hole is. Well, folks, it's my great pleasure to have my friend and fellow Bible prophecy teacher, Bill Salus, here on Prophetic Perspectives. Bill's the author of Israelistine, the Ancient Blueprints of the Future Middle East, and Psalm 83 War. He's written a whole book on that chapter of Psalm 83. Bill, I'm so glad you could join us and help us talk about Psalm 83 because you believe, right, that Psalm 83 is the missing piece to this Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecy?
Well, I do, and the Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecy, as you know, is a really big deal. It's the marquee event that God has chosen to make His holy name known, and through His people Israel, that the nations will know He's Lord. So it's a critically important prophecy. But the Israel that is involved, the descriptions were given by Ezekiel in chapter 38, verses 7 through 13. I don't believe exists presently in those conditions. It has to be dwelling securely in the midst of the land without walls, bars, or gates. And, you know, Nathan, presently Israel's not dwelling securely. They've got about 150,000 missiles to the north of them, Hezbollah, some of them precision guided. There's chemical weapons in Syria. Hamas continues to lob missiles. There's estimates, Jerusalem Post came out with an article not too long ago that in a war with Hezbollah and Hamas, there could be an estimated 1,000 missiles from each corner direction, Hamas and Hezbollah each, lobbing 1,000 missiles a day into Israel. So, and they have walls all around Israel. It's probably the most fenced-in and fortified nation in the world. Plus, they have that partition wall that separates Palestinian terrorism out of Israel proper. It's over 400 miles long. At some points, it's 20 feet high and filled with concrete. So there's a big thing to me that has to happen. There's another war, a war predicted in Psalm 83, 3,000 years ago by Asaph, and it's involving different countries that surround Israel. That would include where Lebanon is, where Hezbollah is, Philistia, ancient Philistia, where the Hamas are, Syria, etc. That I believe is going to happen. And none of those countries are in Ezekiel 38 also. So something has to happen to them. They're Israel's neighbors. They share common borders with Israel. They've been Israel's notorious enemies from time immemorial. And Psalm 83 talks about them having a war with Israel.
Interesting. So a lot of Bible prophecy teachers are teaching right now that this Gog and Magog war, as Ezekiel 38 and 39 describes, is the next big prophetic war. But you're saying that there's another war that precedes that fills the hole. It's interesting when you read the countries in the Gog and Magog war. You got Russia, Iran, Turkey, Libya, the Sudan. You've got all those Stan nations like Tajikistan and all. But what's missing in that prophecy are the countries directly bordering Israel, right? That would be Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Gaza. And those are actually listed in Psalm 83, right? We've got if you read in Psalm 83 verse 5, for they have consulted together with one consent, they form a confederacy against you, the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gebal, Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre, Assyria also has joined with them. They have helped the children a lot. Now, those don't sound like the nations that border Israel, right?
Well, and of course, those are the ancient names. Back then when Asaph wrote, there were no Hezbollah or Jordanian. Jordan became a country in 1946. So we have to figure out, well, who is he talking about? The Edomites and Ammonites and Moabites and the Gigabites and the Megabites. I always like to throw that in for a little bit of humor. But so it turns out that does include all those countries. I call them an inner circle of countries that share common borders with Israel. Like you said, Lebanon, Syria, even Iraq should be involved, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Jordan has a peace treaty with Israel right now. But I point out in those two books you talked about how there's wars coming between Israel and Jordan, and they have not found fulfillment yet. They seem to be peripheral prophecies to Psalm 83, and those peace treaties are fragile. They will not be in part of those prophecies, and Israel will win. The Israeli Defense Forces exist in fulfillment of Bible prophecy, not for Ezekiel 38, because God stops at or supernaturally. It's a massive invasion. The Israeli Defense Forces nor the American forces are pictured in that prophecy. God stops it with an earthquake and fire and hailstone and brimstone, etc. But the Israeli Defense Forces are all over Bible prophecy for the purposes of taking out their neighbors, defending the nation. And in those books, I list almost 150 peripheral passages that talk about Psalm 83 and I think those related wars.
It's interesting what the motive is for those countries surrounding Israel. We read that in Psalm 83:4. They say, "Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more." So it looks like the Israel's bordering neighbors desire to erase Israel from existence. Bill, I have a question. Psalm 83 is what's called an imprecatory prayer. In other words, it calls down judgment and justice upon an enemy. You can read that in Psalm 83, 13 through 18 pretty well. "Oh my God, make them like a whirling dust, like the chaff before the wind. As the fire burns the woods and flame sets the mountains on fire, so pursue them with your tempest and frighten them with your storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek your name." So some people will say, well, Psalm 83 is just an imprecatory prayer generally against Israel's enemies, but you say it's a prophecy. Why the difference there? Is it really a prophecy? What makes Psalm 83 particularly a prophecy and not just an imprecatory prayer?
Well, I think it's both. It's a prayer of lament, but when you read those verses, he was talking about make them like chaff before the wind. So make who? Those confederacy of nations that come together in a confederacy that form a devious plan to cut the nation of Israel off, to wipe Israel off the map. And so and also Asaph, who wrote the Psalm, he wrote 12 Psalms, and Psalm 83, it was one of his most prophetic. We're told in 2 Chronicles 29:30 that he was actually a seer, a prophet, as much the same Hebrew word we would say for a prophet. We're also told in 1 Chronicles 25 verse 2 that Asaph was under the direction, the sons of Asaph were under the direction of Asaph, who prophesied according to the order of the king. So, he was a prophet, and of his 12 Psalms, this one and Psalm 50 were probably his most prophetic. So I think we have a contemporary confederacy. This is not a list of chronological order, list of Israel's enemies. It's a contemporary group that comes together and confederates, and that's why he said, make them like chaff before the wind, etc., like that, and that they would perish. See, so some people think in 1948, when the Arab-Israeli War of Independence happened, those countries were pretty much, that you talked about, the tents of Edom, etc., were involved in that war, but that did not end the oppression like Asaph petitioned for in Psalm 83 verses 7 through 9. And so what happens is, 9 through 11. So what happens is they came back and fought them in 1967 and again in 1973. So it hasn't found conclusion yet. They have not perished. They still oppress Israel. And so from my perspective, I'm still looking for this to be probably one of the next prophecies to happen. And then when it happens, those neighboring enemies of Israel will no longer be a problem, and Israel can dwell securely. They can tear down that partition wall. They can tear down the walls they got between Lebanon and Hezbollah. They can tear down the walls they got around with Gaza. They got walls with Jordan as well. So they can get rid of all that stuff. Plus they got security checkpoints throughout Israel. It's just not the safe dwelling Israel described in Ezekiel 38.
Well, thank you, Bill. That clears up a lot. Folks, if you want to know more about the Psalm 83 war, visit prophecydepotministries.net or pick up Bill's book, Psalm 83, The Missing Prophecy Revealed. I found it fascinating. If you want more information too, go to christandprophecy.org. We have a few Christ and Prophecy television episodes where Bill has been kindly enough to explain more in detail about the Psalm 83 war. Keep looking up. Jesus Christ is coming soon.